Welcome to week 5 of Grief and the Architecture of Belonging. We're so grateful you've joined us, especially grateful to the folks who are here in the room with us. It's so helpful to us to have people here so we're not just speaking to each other. And welcome if you're joining us on the recording. I'm Suzanne Jabour. I'm a grief guide and educator, and I come to this work after the death of my son, Ben, just over 5 years ago. That rupture in my life was as momentous as you would expect it to be if you allow yourself to imagine that possibility, and really changed the trajectory of my world. And now my dedication is to studying, teaching, guiding grievers, and really being very intentionally engaged with what's happening with grief on every level. And that's what brought me to this really powerful conversation with my colleague, Annie Emprima, which this week is going to take us out to the level of community and more collective grief, which we're seeing all around us right now. Annie, I'd love you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what brought you to this conversation.
I am a metaphysical trauma researcher, which doesn't sound very exciting own right, but it is quite fascinating when we start diving into what causes trauma and how our body processes trauma. I have experienced all of these layers of belonging that we've been talking about thus far and will continue talking about through the 8-week series. And in that, I have found patterns in these observations that I've had as I have moved through the different phases and the different layers of belonging. And so I study trauma from a metaphysical perspective, meaning that I'm looking at the stuff that no one else is looking at. I'm looking at the things that we can't measure with reliable, predictable, repeatable data. I want to find out how much of an influence those factors play in our healing and also in our hurting, whether it's as an individual or as a society. Community is something that's very close to my interest because it's such an important element to our well-being. And yet it's not marketed that way in our society and in our culture. We don't tend and befriend in our community as well as we should be or could be. And so I want to take a little bit more emphasis in this because very often we may not have functional households. We may not grow up in places that are safe. But even in high school, when we look at high school and middle school kids, they tend to lean into the community. And so community plays a much larger role than we're talking about. And that's why we're here. So as with any grief session that we have, we always start with a breathing exercise because we may say something along the way that activates something within a viewer or our live audience here. And I want to make sure that we are somatically prepared for that, that we are honoring how our body processes information. And I want to make sure that when people leave this conversation, they're leaving in a good space. So we always start with a breathing exercise, and I want to work on coherent breathing. Specifically, we're going to do painting the wall, which might look like a Tai Chi move. And the purpose of this type of breathing is to slow everything down, slow it way down. So much so that we're only doing 5 to 6 breath cycles in a full minute. So what that's going to look like before we start the breathing, it's to take your hands as if you're painting. So you're going to drop your hands and you're going to let them go down the wall. And then you're going to paint up the wall. And each movement is 5 to 6 seconds, or 5 to 6 breaths rather. So it could take about 10 to 11 seconds for a full cycle. So we breathe down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6, and then breathe up. Inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we're going to come back down slowly in a continuous loop. And for those standing, you're going to have a longer drop. For those that are sitting, just take your time moving your hands. And as you do, you're slowing your heart rate. You're slowing everything down. You're coming into your parasympathetic. And for those that want to remember it, think about us sympathetic as the spaceship that leaves when things are dangerous. And the parachute, P, parasympathetic, P brings you back down to the ground in that parachute. So what we want to do is give your body permission to let the parachutes land safely. Come into your parasympathetic, slow, steady heart rate. Slow down the breathing. And in moving the hands, what we're also doing is we're activating some of the sensors, energetic sensors in our neck, because our nerves run down the superhighway of our spine. And those nerves and the meridians hold a lot of tension. So we're slowing everything, all of the systems, the circulatory, the respiratory, the nervous system. We're going to go one more, one more up, one more down. Okay. And our final painting of the wall. All right. All right, so welcome to the conversation, everyone. And for those that are in the live audience, please put your questions in the chat, and we will address a lot of those questions at the end of the recording. And for those that are listening on the replay, feel free to put those comments in the chat box, and we'll monitor that for 90 days. All right, Suzanne, so community. You're in Canada. I'm in the United States. Tell me about community where you live.
Such a big question in this context. I think where we've seen it a lot lately, interestingly, because there is a grief piece to it, is in the fracturing of the relationship actually between our two countries. And I know countries comes later. It might even be next week, right? That national level. But we've really seen that happen at the community level, where there's a different conversation about how do we even relate to our neighbors. And I think in a way that's even more tightly connected with grief. We had a 2 weeks ago now, a school shooting in a small town in the province that I live in. So provinces are equivalent of states. Small towns are small towns. The thing that's different in Canada is this is, to the best of my ability to research, the 10th mass shooting in our country's history. So in the history of the whole entire country, this is the 10th one. So it lands a little bit differently for us here, I think, than it does in the US. And it really rocked our country because it's so unusual. The tragedy is so nuanced and multi-leveled. And what I thought was really interesting in that moment was what we saw here, were all our politicians coming together to say, we stand with this community. It happened that the perpetrator was a young trans woman with some severe mental health challenges. So it would have been very easy to weaponize that identity, which we're seeing weaponized so much in the US right now, but other places in the world as well, not as much in Canada. But it was interesting to see sort of our political community come together, our communities come together. The flags were down. They just went back up this Tuesday. So for 2 weeks, the flags in our whole province were at half-mast. This was a big deal for us. And I think what we see then in community around those circumstances that we can identify as sort of worthy of grief is that we come together. It's not for long enough. It's not perfectly, because we're human. It's not going to be all of the support that community needs, because they're going to need a community of approximately 2,000 people. And this is going to have blown that community apart. So they will need long-term ongoing support. But that community sense of coming together was really beautiful to see. Where I think we're lacking that is with all the grief that we've been talking about in this series that isn't related to death.
Yes.
And that's that grief around, you identified in our last week that you see it really happening from the subprime housing mortgage crisis that happened in the US in 08, 09. We didn't have that here because of our different financial structures. I encourage people to look at it from COVID because that for me, March 13th, Friday the 13th, literally had my hand on the doorknob to go to work and got a call from my boss saying, don't come in. That was a big deal in my industry and my job. And we can all identify when that moment was for us, when everything changed. And then we can count all the losses from then, losses of individuals, losses of ceremony, weddings, graduations, vacations, gatherings, so much loss and
Mhm.
loss in our connection to each other in so many ways when things like masking and vaccines started to become weaponized and used to create division instead of used as a way we could all stand up and support each other. Um, so I just see so much grief happening at this community level right now. And I'm curious how you see it impacting in the metaphysical way. And, that's only one version of community, right? Because community happens. And I'd love for you to break down some of those other levels of community and where you see those metaphysical connections being impacted.
I look at it from a sociological perspective, from a psychological perspective. I'm looking at it from obviously a metaphysical perspective, the energetic, how the impact of a loss of safety, and that can be it can be an affiliation like a sports team that's a community, the athletic community. There's also sexual orientation affiliations, the LGBTQIA. We have a military community. There are so many different communities. Medical, a lot of people that have similar medical diagnoses will create communities, bereavement groups. There's all church and religious institutions. There are so many types of community, and it's so important for us to be in a community. So important for us. But that doesn't mean that we know everybody in the membership, so to speak. We don't need to know, if someone is of a particular category. You don't need to know everyone in the category. That's unrealistic. But it's about having a shared commonality. And so in a community, when we look at geographic neighborhoods, yes, so like if there's a loss of life that was uh, from an egregious act, that shakes everyone in the community. If we look at racial division, if something happens to a particular member in a neighborhood, it's really hard not to absorb that as that could have been me too. And so when we're processing grief, sometimes we're processing it in a secondhand way of that could have been me. Or we're carrying that grief of my neighbor is in pain. My fellow member of this community is in pain. Where I'm seeing these community issues, and we are going to get into country, but country is looking at the highest governing authority. So when you're talking about like Canada and the US being neighbors, that is community. Because we're driving, those are bordering cities. People are driving in and out. They're sharing space, physical space. When we're looking at country, we're not really looking at physical space, or we're not looking at where we know a certain number of members in that community. The level of community connection brings a level of safety. If a child comes into a neighborhood and all of the neighbors are disconnected from that child doesn't really have rootedness. But if the child knows that this person lives here and this person lives here and they have kids and they don't have kids, it creates this sense of safety coming into a place, even if they don't know the people. They know the points within their own neighborhood that are safe places. And when we remove those things, when we come into a society where we're not developing community, we don't really have a reason to care about our neighbor. And that comes with its own grief. And that is like one of the most invisible, the grief of neglect from communication and connection to the people around us. To live 15, 20 feet from someone and not know who they are has an unmeasured empty value. And we don't think about that not knowing our neighbors versus knowing our neighbors, there's a gap. Feeling connected and feeling protected and not feeling connected and not feeling protected, that there's a Grand Canyon gap there. There's such value in having connection. And I have my own communities. I have a women's networking group. They've been meeting the first and third Tuesday of every month here in Las Vegas. And I have talked about this through the years, the importance of tend and befriend. When there's high stress points in time, instead of going into fight, flight, freeze, we come together. Let's get some coffee, let's get some muffins, let's talk about what's going on. And we move together in the tending, that mother hen, let's come together, and the befriending of let's do this all together as a group, like we're going to caravan in and we're going to hold the circle and we're going to keep everyone safe as a group. And we're lacking that in our society, in our culture. We don't give that enough value. And when we don't give that value, inevitably grief comes because it's an emptiness, it's a loneliness. So it's the desire and the fantasy that a lot of people go through of wishing they were more connected. But why is that not a shared desire being openly spoken about so that everyone's wishes of being connected are honoring each other? And so when something tragedy happens, are people coming together? Are we tending and befriending, or are we going in our separate ways and perpetuating the grief that we're processing and digesting? But because it's unnamed, we don't even know how to tag that luggage in our mental sorting system. So community is a really powerful conversation to have.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things there that landed for me. I think back to, when my kids were little, we lived in a neighborhood that was very much a community.
Mm-hmm.
It was right on the edge of being a little bit too small towny for me because I'm a big city kind of a gal. And I was like, I don't really need everybody to know all my business.
Yep.
And in the sort of 10 houses, the five houses on either side of the street from our house, we knew every family. We knew all of their kids. We would take turns as moms in the summertime sitting out watching all of the kids play in the street. Like it was one of those kinds of neighborhoods. And now I live in the city in an apartment and there's 23 units. So it's a very small apartment. And I know by name four other people. Like four other, they're all single. So four other people. So one, two, three, I lied, three other people. And I probably know six or eight other people. So about four other units by sight.
Mm-hmm.
And the other people I don't even know by sight. And we live in the same building. It's also partly because we don't have to use the elevator. So we don't run into each other in the elevator or the hallways because of the design of our building. We don't have that. But it's so interesting that sense of lack of community in our proximal community, like in our physical space community. And it's interesting that changed in our building with COVID, because before that, every summer we had a barbecue and we would all get together and you'd get to meet the people who had moved in over the winter. Because when it's winter here, it's cold. We all kind of hibernate a little bit. You would get to meet everybody. At one point, there was enough kids in the building that the moms would set up stuff in the courtyard and the kids would all be playing and you get to go out and say hi, whatever it was. That all ended with COVID, to the point that we even do our strata meetings now on Zoom. We used to do them in somebody's apartment. So we are all that less connected with each other, even in our proximal, like go and borrow a cup of sugar from back in the day. You can knock on any number of doors and they would gladly give you a cup of sugar. Now it's like, who do I know well enough to bother? Like it's a whole different dynamic. And that unnamed loss, I think, is so valuable when you're saying, like, that's an unnamed loss. And the other thing that I wanted to touch on, which I think is so important, is that sense of community, almost like by category, just for lack of a better word, by demographic. So I am a member of the bereaved parents community
Mm-hmm.
by nature of the fact that my son has died. In real life, I don't know very many other bereaved parents. I know two. So not very many of the people who I knew who are parents out of that bigger group, two of them are also bereaved parents. But I know that on a global scale, or on a country scale, or on a scale of any other measure than just the people I know in person, I'm part of a really big community. And that sense of community, even though we can't name all of those other people, and we maybe don't know very many of them, if you're somewhere where you're, really feeling like you're the only one of whatever the label is, just that sense that there are other people out there having a similar experience can give us a lot of comfort and give us a lot of support in an energetic sense. I feel that anyway, when when something's happening for me and I think, oh, but I'm not the only one this has happened to. there are other bereaved parents, or there are other, women entrepreneurs, there are other grief educators, there are other whatever it is, that's the sphere where I'm feeling something. When I can hook into just that sense of community, even if I can't phone one of them, then I feel more supported and more connected. And that to me is so critical, that we understand just that sense of community calms our system. I'm not
Right.
making that up, right?
No, your chest even exhaled saying it.
Yes.
That's how important this is. And yet it's so invisible in our understanding of human sense of safety.
Yeah. And I think that's because of our individualistic Western, particularly North American, you know, white, it's particularly white North American Western. Let's just own it. It's all our fault. I'll take it. Right. But that sense of, you should be able to do it on your own. You should be independent. You should be all those things. And you should be deeply connected with others.
Because we go into binary thinking in our
Yeah.
society. You're either this or you're this. So if I'm opposed to this, therefore I must be in favor of this without any spectrum or nuance. And we don't see that, yes, we should be able to think independently. We should be able to support ourselves and also still be very connected to our social system, our social support system.
Yeah.
I so much in the trauma work that I do, loneliness plays a huge factor. And it does not have to be blood family. I want to emphasize that because a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
I've worked with have had very dysfunctional childhoods. But we have to find our community. We have to find our people. And it's not like I'm bringing anything new to the table. Harvard has been studying this since the late 1930s, the
Yeah.
study of adult development. This is not new. It's just not talked about enough.
Yeah. And I think what's new and what's changed over time is we've become more and more fractured,
Yeah.
right? As we've become more and more, I don't even know what it is, but it does seem to me like it's that sense of independence. Like we're not getting together to have a quilting bee because I'm really good at sewing the patches together and you're really good at cutting and you're really good at doing the edges. And when we all do this together, we end up with a quilt. I'm making the quilt by myself. And so it's not as good as it could be. And I didn't get that chance to interact with other people.
That's it. It was never about the quilt.
No.
It was never about the quilt. Because when we did it in the military, you would clean your weapons, everyone's cleaning their weapons, and that repetitive motion helped release mental health thoughts. And it was shared community conversation as the repetitive motion. In the same way of cooking it, a bunch of women coming together and cook together, or a
Yep.
bunch of guys, whatever groups coming together and doing a shared task. It's the true value is not in the product that is produced.
Right.
The
Yeah.
highest value is in the shared experience.
And I love that sense of repetitive tasks too, right? Like there is something about, we're going to get together, we're going to clean something, we're going to cook. So we're doing a lot of chopping. It's not necessarily that we're getting together to do tasks that require intellectual growth or learning or all of those, though we can build really deep connection in those communities too, right? I'm in a number of communities that have come out of training programs that I've done, and those communities are connected around our shared language that we've developed together through that training. But that sense of the release of um, those sort of debilitating thoughts and that sense of it being, again, it's that you're not alone.
Yeah.
You're not alone in the task, but you're also not alone in the thinking. You can share your ideas and you have other people say, oh yeah, that happened to me too. Or what I did when that happened was this, maybe try that. And you could say, oh, I don't think that would work for me. Anyone else got an idea? Whatever it is, it's all that shared language, right? This is what we're seeing break down. We don't have a lot of shared language even. Like we use words differently than other people use words. And it's really important that we bring those definitions closer together or we can't even have a conversation. So we've lost that shared language. We've lost that sense of time spent together, that sense of knowing other people are going through similar things. And that understanding really fundamentally that as humans, I think about you're talking about the sociological aspect. I often think sort of anthropologically.
Yeah.
Like it is not that long ago that we would have been in some form of communal living, right? Some form of interdependency. That's actually how we're wired. And so when we're operating in separation from that, that's already a load on our nervous system because we're not in sort of the right relationship, if you will, to each other and through that to ourselves. And where I see that in the grief space especially is that the one universal around grief, which plays out differently for each person each time it happens, but the one universal is that it needs witnessing. That's the
Alice Miller,
universal,
enlightened witness. Yes.
right? So if we don't have shared language, if we don't have a shared basic understanding, if we don't have a shared acknowledgement that the thing your experience is worth grieving, it's very hard to get that witnessing.
Yeah.
And I think that plays out in all kinds of other aspects of our lives where really we just need to feel seen, heard, and valued, right? These basic needs. And we're not getting them filled as robustly as we need to. And I think even those of us, I would challenge even the people who are thinking, oh, that's not me they're talking about. I have all these communities and I have all these great people around me. I would challenge you to really analyze the connection level of those communities and the amount of those communities where you can actually come as your completely whole, truest version of yourself that you're able to be and not feel judged or like you need to perform somehow or like you need to, be, squashed into whatever frame in order to fit in. And I think when we think about it from that lens, we start to really see the lack of connection. And we talked a little bit last week about, in friends and family needing different people for different things. And that's all true. And we 100% need those communities where we are seen as purely ourself without performance.
Yes. I want to talk about entangled emotions.
Mm,
So often we have entangled emotions. We get anger and grief. We can get grief and betrayal. And I think when we look at certain communities that have historically been about coming together, like the Hispanic community
mhm.
here in the United States, and the certain voting positions people have taken, I think about this community that is historically been very much about coming together and embracing culture. And what happens when members of that community vote against their own people? How someone might internalize it as my own people don't even care about me. And how that can break down. It breaks down the confidence of people, of households, how it ripples when we don't feel valued in our own community and how we experience it, because it can come out as anger, but it's really grief, right? That's that shield of anger protecting the grief behind it. It's betrayal with grief behind it. And I have had conversations with many people of entanglement, emotional entanglement, because we don't understand how these emotions can come together. Like someone can be so hurt, but be laughing as a trauma response. We don't recognize that grief exists in places where anger is loud. We don't see that grief exists in places where isolation is loud. Sometimes the behavior isn't the way we expect it to be, with teary eyes and melancholy response. That grief can look a lot like other things because those emotions have entangled. And whichever emotion is the loudest is the one that gets heard.
And I think too, it's whichever emotion is the most socially acceptable,
Hey,
right?
touche. Touche.
Because it's okay to be angry.
For
Weirdly,
listeners, women, if I get angry, that
yeah.
is a little bit harder than a guy getting angry.
But I would challenge that it's probably more comfortable for other people for you to be angry than for you to be in grief,
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I saw that in the military.
right?
If I was like really upset about something and hurting, uh, they're like, let's just give you a box of tissues. We'll come back. And like they couldn't hold it. They couldn't hold
Yeah.
a container for me of, and this did happen in the military. I was supposed to have a particular job and we were struggling financially during the housing crisis. And 3 weeks before it was, I had gotten months notice that I was going to be taking this role. while my unit deployed, and then it ended up going to somebody else because a higher ranking individual wanted to favor their friend. And I was just in so like, because I had planned so much of my life around having that financial income and the steadiness with a newborn child. And I was pregnant at the time. And so this was something that I was gonna get it as soon as,
Mhm.
and so it was like all these other, the ripple effect of financial and emotional and my mental stability of trying to manage a household with all of these major life events shifting. And then they're like, yes, it's going to someone else. And I'm in the middle of military training, and I'm snot coming out, crying. Like I'm just
Yeah.
trying to process like how I could feel this letdown from my unit of, and they're not realizing all the other elements that were stacked behind it. And I'm just crying. And I've never seen more uncomfortable people in my life.
Yeah.
Really difficult of not understanding the depth that I was feeling in that moment of I'm really screwed now.
Yeah. And what would have shifted if in that moment someone could have witnessed the grief piece
Yeah.
and said something like, oh, wow, I know you were really counting on that. And I know counting on that meant that you had this whole vision of how this was all going to unfold.
Yeah.
And that just all collapsed. And you must have some big emotions about that.
Yeah.
And just name them. Let's go. Let's name them together. That's what shifts with that witnessing, right?
It
That
is.
you don't, that it's more than here's your box of Kleenex, please go away and come back when you're settled, right? And if in that moment you had let the anger take over and had an explosion, right? I think of oh my gosh, what's the name of that fabulous Disney Inside Out, right? If you
Oh,
had let
yeah.
anger, if you had let the flame come and like screamed and railed, they would have all been there for you, right? They would have been like, yeah, that's terrible. We can all be angry together. But when it's grief, people are like, oh no, I don't like that. I don't know. I don't even want to call it grief because grief is so scary. I don't even say that word out loud or quietly in my head to myself. And then that all gets disenfranchised.
Yes.
And
Like,
now we're all carrying around all this disenfranchised grief that we don't even know to call it that. And if we can name it, then we can, well, first of all, just naming the emotion helps them to keep moving. But if we can name it and understand it as grief, there are ways to do grief. Grief is also a verb, and there are ways to do it. But if we can't even call it that, then we just carry it around.
the military has a difficult time carrying grief
Yeah.
as a, in itself. And I remember this conversation with someone who is very active in funeral services, and I asked her how she does it, like how, because
Mm,
I cry. I could not be in the honor guard because I cry at these funerals. And she said, "Oh, yeah, most of us are on Prozac."
great.
So the illusion of having it together is false. We're all holding it together, thinking everybody else is holding it together better, and no one's really holding it together.
And it's interesting to me. I've so distanced, like I have no sense of really how the military operates, except I'm very grateful for them in many ways. And but it seems from the outside like you would have to dissociate. Like if you let that grief overwhelm you in a combat situation, you are useless to all
Yeah.
of us.
Mhm.
You can't, right? You have to kind of dissociate, which is okay because grievers in our normal life do that too. Sometimes you just have to dissociate from it a little bit to get whatever it is done or to get through the thing or whatever. What I think is missing from what I hear from military folks is then that moment where we all come together to process it.
Yeah.
It's like, we will teach you how to dissociate and then we're going to leave you there, which
Yes.
is not a good long-term mental health strategy.
And we're seeing that in the numbers, like
Yeah.
seeing the mental health numbers, and it's staggeringly scary.
Yeah. And hopefully that will shift. I really am a firm believer, bless my Angelou. I really believe that when we know better, we do better. And holy cow, we need to start doing better fast
Yeah.
because our communities, no matter how you slice it, our communities are suffering.
Yes. Across the board, all communities are suffering.
Yeah. Yeah. Everyone. And I'm so interested by that idea of, feeling like our community is voting against us.
Yeah.
And I've been so fascinated by how that has happened because I've watched that, I haven't seen it as clearly happen in Canada. It's a little bit different political system. And it's not so in our face all the time. We don't have this every 2 year election cycle where we're just campaigning all the time. It's very different. Our campaigns are short and sweet. But I think because we're campaigning all the time in the US, we see that othering that happens within a community. It's like we have to, if I'm voting against the best interests of my community, I have to believe that the interests of that community don't actually apply to me. And I think we're seeing that play out more and more with some of the things that are happening with ICE, where people are saying, oh, but wait a minute, I didn't think, when he said X and they came to do Y, I didn't think that meant me or my husband or my family. There was some ability to dissociate from, wait a minute, he's actually talking about me. And that has played out across many spectrums in many different ways, and not just with this current administration. But it's so interesting to me to see that sort of writ large at the moment. When everything is heightened, we're seeing things more clearly, I think, than we've been able to in the past, which is a blessing and a curse, and means that, we know better. And then we have to do better.
The stewardship and ownership. People weren't
Yeah.
saying my community and all of the people that are in my community. It was me and mine. I'm
Mm.
going to vote with me in mind. So they're voting in household mentality for community issues, or the federal level. It was me and mine. They're voting about me and mine, not all of the members that fall into that space. And that's where we've really lost a sense of stewardship of community, is to recognize that not everyone is me and mine. And ours is very diverse. So communities where it's predominantly a particular group, in the United States, particularly, let's say, white Christian group, they're all voting, even though they're voting for their sector, it's impacting other sectors, other religions, other community members, other individuals that represent different groups. And there was no thought about how do we take care of everyone in this perimeter. It was me, ultimately me and mine. They're voting just on what their values were, not on the values of all of the members. And that's where that fracture really cuts deep. And the amount of hurt that creates, the amount of healing that is required, is twice as much as the hurt.
Mm.
So the act of healing that space is going to take twice as much effort as it did to, right? It's really easy to take a razor and cut into skin. It's a lot harder to create those stitches. So the
And I
healing
think, yeah.
takes so much more effort.
And what that analogy brought up so clearly for me too is it's effort over time.
Yes, over time.
Because that healing isn't instant either. We don't repair those rifts instantly. And it's going to take on all of our efforts over time to get back to that place where, and I'm not sort of, yearning for the halcyon days of old. I would like us to get back to civil discourse, right? Let's get back to the place where we have some shared language, some ability to acknowledge each other as humans first, because then we can see people's emotional selves too,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's what I'm all about. You're about that metaphysical piece, which is so connected to that. It's about looking at more than just me, just my family. It's about looking at all of the communities that I belong to. How does this impact all of them? Right? Because if you're over identified with only one of your communities and you're voting only in that tiny part of your identity's best interest,
Mm-hmm.
the other parts of your identity, you're fracturing yourself.
Yes. And
That was
that's
a few weeks
ultimately
ago.
what it
Join us,
does.
join us for episode 1 and week 1 and 2 when we went into what's happening at the self level. We're fracturing ourselves in honor of this one community that we're part of,
Yeah.
while ignoring all the other communities we're part of that our behavior is impacting.
You can't fracture one layer without it hitting the neighbors.
Yeah.
If something happens with friends and family, if something happens in our household, the children in that household are going to school, the adults are going to work, it inevitably ripples into other layers. It's all interconnected.
Yeah.
So when we heal one, we have to heal one at a time, but we have to heal one to heal the next layer. And then the next layer, and then the next layer. And then that final one, the belief system, is what closes it all, because I believe that all of us have a right to feel safe here, right? My belief system becomes the shield for everything within. But if I believe that everyone's against me, then every single layer breaks. So that
Yeah.
belief system has to be on the outside, because it really is the frame around the picture how we see the world. So
Yeah. I
yes.
love that. We're going to carry on next week. We'll go another step out as we get to that layer of belief system. So next week is at the national and the global level. So taking a step out of our community, physical, proximal identifier community, right? Really to that next level of what happens when it's national, what happens when it's global. Because if our eyes are open, we are seeing that on the global stage. We're seeing it on the national stage. We're seeing it between nations very loudly right now. That's what we'll be talking about next week. We hope you can join us, either live in the room, catching up on the recording. And of course, we have a question for you to reflect on, journal on, to hold you over till then. Can you share our questions for this week, Annie?
Yes, we have a two-part question. So I want individuals, I'll give the actual question, but I'm going to explain it first. For individuals to think of a community that they belong to, whatever that may be, and what has that community experienced as a loss? It can be near, far, geographically close. How did it affect your sense of safety? And how did your body respond to that loss? So again, when a community loss is experienced, near or far, how did it make you feel less safe in the world? And where did it hit your body? And feel free to put that in the comments, whichever social media platform you're watching this on, put it in the comments. We'll monitor for 90 days. And as always, audience stand by, and we will have that conversation with you after the recording. So thank you everyone for being here. We will see you next week.